Hello, everyone, and welcome to our series on anti-racism parenting. I am Dr. Lisa Konick. I'm a psychologist and owner of Konick and Associates, which is a family behavioral health practice with offices in got to get my places right, South Naperville and Orland Park. And today I have with me Ivette Dubiel. Dr. Dubiel is an expert in equity and social justice, and she's going to be speaking to us and providing us with some important resources on how to speak with our children about issues related to racism and social justice. What I'd like to do is introduce Dr. Dubiel. I'm very excited to have her here today, and please feel free to post questions as you are watching today, and we'll have some resources available for parents as well. I'm going to introduce Dr. Dubiel, and then we'll have her take it from here. Dr. Ivette Dubiel is the Executive Director of Equity and Professional Learning for the DuPage Regional Office of Education. In her role, she guides and supports school districts in their efforts to advance systemic equity through coaching, audits, and extensive professional learning opportunities. Due to demand, Dr. Dubiel also serves as a consultant to nonprofits and corporations through trainings on equity and social justice. She has served as the Director of Educational Equity for Indian Prairie School District 204 and Assistant Director of Special Programs overseeing the English Language Learning Program, Gifted Education, and Parent Outreach for District 308. She also serves as adjunct instructors at Lewis University and Aurora University and runs Equity University for enrolled districts. Dr. Dubiel has also advised nonprofits and corporations on their journey to develop understanding of equity and social justice. Previous to her career into education, Dr. Dubiel was an investigator with the Chicago Police Department Office of Professional Standards, where she investigated allegations of excessive force against police. Dr. Dubiel currently leads the Illinois Coalition of Education Equity Leaders and the DuPage Equity of Excellence Network. And that's an abbreviated bio on you, Dr. Dubiel. Thank you for joining us today. We're very delighted to have you here to talk to our families and our parents about how they can talk to their children about racism and promoting anti-racism in their families.
That's right. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So let's dive in with that first kind of inquiry about anti-racism. Mm-hmm. And what I share when I talk to families, community members, is that there is a difference between non-racist and anti-racist. A non-racist, I think many people get confused, is the idea of really not doing anything deliberately when it comes to having conversations about race. Oftentimes working with families, I will hear, well, I raise my child or children to be colorblind. I raise my child or children to just love everyone and respect differences. Mm-hmm. To respect differences is to be applauded, right? We should do that. But colorblind is very harmful because the idea with colorblind is, well, we don't see color. And if we don't see color, we don't acknowledge race. And if we don't acknowledge race, we don't acknowledge the lived experiences that people of color have experienced and continue to experience historically and today all the time. So how do we fight racism with a colorblind attitude? Mm-hmm. So non-racist is very passive. Anti-racist is active. It's doing the work. It's looking at ourselves first before we have those conversations with our children. So let me be clear about something. The journey for anti-racism is a lifelong journey. Right? This doesn't mean because it's a lifelong journey, you're never going to have a conversation with your child. But it absolutely requires us to acknowledge the racist tendencies many people have. In fact, most people have. And the reason why is because we are socialized, what's called agents of socialization, by these different ways of racism. So when we were young, I always ask parents, what was the first time you noticed race? What was the context of noticing race? What about your race, the race of others? What associations or assumptions have you made regarding race? What are you doing to actively combat the negative associations regarding race? It's a very deliberate, consistent, and vulnerable process to be anti-racist and to embed anti-racism parenting with your kids. And it's all the time and it's exhausting. But we absolutely can do things in our home, in our daily language that I know we'll talk about, for our parents to be anti-racist. So one more thing with non-racist, sometimes parents will say, well, I'm not racist. We don't do this. We don't say this. We don't do this. Rather than telling me what you don't do with your child, tell me what you are doing to really talk about race and be an anti-racist parent and educator. And when I say parent, please know I'm all inclusive. So it's parent, guardians, or caretakers. We know that it is not necessarily biological parents who are raising all of our children.
Thank you for that explanation, Dr. Dubiel. One of the things that I have talked to a fair number of our families about very recently, as a matter of fact, the issues with Mr. Floyd have really sparked a lot of conversation about these topics, and I think it's well needed, is parents are concerned that they don't want to make things uncomfortable. And, one of the things I talk to families about as a therapist is this is work. And when we talk about these issues, it is uncomfortable. These are uncomfortable topics. And I hope that we're looking forward to hearing from you about how we can, that's a really good reflective thing to think about, is our own vulnerabilities and what we bring into the picture within our families. And I also have been thinking and talking about implicit bias. And if you could speak to that, I think that would be very useful to get a description of what that means.
Sure. So let's talk about the uncomfortable part first. We absolutely have to sit in the discomfort, because for one person to acknowledge their racist tendencies, their racist ideologies, we get defensive. We feel guilty rather than acknowledging, yeah, we may in fact have been influenced by friends, by peers, by religion, by media, by all these different agents that absolutely shape our decision making, that shape assumptions and associations that we make, that in fact we have racist tendencies that embed and infuse our thoughts and attitudes and behaviors, even if we don't say it out loud. Right? So we have to sit in that discomfort. In talking with our children, it has to be mature appropriate as opposed to age appropriate, because we know some children are more appropriate than others. And you scaffold, meaning you build up to how deep you're going to go with your child. But it can start very, very young. In fact, we know that children develop and recognize and acknowledge race when they're babies. So there's things you can do, from making sure you have, if your child plays with dolls, do you have a diversity of dolls? Looking at the dolls and playing dolls with your child and talking about how some dolls are perceived not nice. And some dolls are perceived nicer than others because of their skin tone, and how that's not okay, right? We can build up to that and then go deeper into the historical oppression experienced by people of color. Then we can go deeper into how that oppression still exists today in every institution. We're talking about housing, employment, healthcare, policing, criminal justice, and education. It's still continuing, right? That's a conversation that perhaps when our children are older, we can go in and talk about that. We could look at the data to look at this negative disproportionality by race. So having these conversations is a consistent practice. I also ask parents to be proactive and reactive. Find those opportunities. If your child says something, be reactive and have a conversation, so you have you could engage with them about something they have said or done, and then use proactive opportunities to have teachable moments. So really quickly, even though it's not related to race, it does speak to being very proactive in the conversations. So I will share really quickly that this last my family celebrates Thanksgiving. And this last Thanksgiving, my mother hosted, and I just paid attention to what was going on. And the day after Thanksgiving, I gave my mom a call and asked her if I could run a scenario by her. And she's like, sure. I said, Mom, let's say you have 10 kids at your home, right? You've got 5 girls and 5 boys, and they make a mess. And you say, kids, time to clean up. And the girls got to cleaning and the boys got to play outside. Would you think that was fair? She said, no, absolutely not. I go, Mom, can you tell me why after Thanksgiving dinner, the women had to clean up and the men got to hang out? Right? And of course, this is also why I don't get invited to family events, right? But her
of yours.
her reaction to it was like, but that wasn't my intention. And intention doesn't equal impact. And nonverbal communication is most communication. For my 9-year-old niece at the time, that was very clear to her. She was receiving messages that she has a responsibility because she's a girl. And when she grows up, if her gender identity is a female, she must do these things. So we have to be very intentional. And so on the drive home from Thanksgiving, I spoke with my teenage boys about, let's examine what we just saw, what we just experienced. So then finding those proactive opportunities to have those teachable moments with our kids. As far as implicit bias, so every human being has implicit bias. The brain, if we think of the brain as a system, then the human brain is the most complex system on a planet, sophisticated system, nothing quite like it. We process a ridiculous amount of information per second, millions of pieces of information. And most of that information, as we get older and wiser, is processed through implicit or unconscious biases. Bias, by definition, is a predisposition, a partiality, a preference. And we all have biases. We have explicit biases and implicit. And the explicit bias is something you can tell your neighbor that you like and don't like, right? I give the example of you can explain to your neighbor what's your favorite dessert. It's an explicit bias. You can also tell your neighbor something you don't like or a fear, right? It's also an explicit bias, positive, negative. Well, the same is with implicit bias. An implicit bias, it could be positive because some implicit bias can save your life, right? For example, if you are driving, you'll swerve immediately to the left to save your life or the life of others. That's your implicit side of your brain at work. It's quick, it's fast, very little decision making is happening. It's automatic. But there's also the negative implicit bias. And that is something all humans have. We all have negative associations that are hurtful, that are negative, are unfair and unjust towards people. And even though some people cannot explicitly name when these negative implicit bias started forming in our brain, we know we have been influenced and conditioned to think negatively and unfairly and unjustly about people. And so with negative implicit biases, the hardest pill to swallow, I believe, is the fact that no human being can get rid of 100% of their negative implicit bias. You don't even know it's occurring most of the time. And it even occurs in our dreams and we're asleep. But what we do know is that you can deliberately, significantly decrease your negative and implicit bias. And it doesn't happen because you have a good heart. It doesn't happen because you want the best, right? It happens with intentionality. We have to avoid all forms of generalizations or stereotypes. We have to avoid all forms of automatic associations. We have to avoid false information and get the facts, right? Build our empathy, listen to people's stories, believe people's stories. So it requires us to be very deliberate in the process, and it is consistent because we're fighting against a lifetime of how we've been conditioned to think about people. So the implicit bias is very, very, very powerful.
It's interesting that when you're describing this, Ivette, I'm thinking a lot about our therapy approach in cognitive behavioral therapy and how we are programmed for certain reactions and how we have to really work to pay attention to what I call our negative self-talk or just our general self-talk. Because that self-talk comes from lots of places. It can come from our insecurities, our vulnerabilities, what our families have kind of promoted to us, whether we agree with them or not. We take on a lot of this dialogue, and we really do need to pay attention to our self-talk and assess it. To ask, is this realistic? Is it rational thinking? Is it framed in data or evidence? Or, and I think that really relates to a lot of what you're saying is it's work.
It is work.
It's effortful work. And it does become a little more automatic or easier or more recognizable as you practice it over time.
It does. It absolutely does.
I thank you for that. And let's see, we have a few questions that were posted. Another question that was posted was microaggressions. Can you reference microaggressions? What does that mean? And maybe even provide some examples. Sure. And what can parents do or what can they help their kids do if they're experiencing or observing these things happening in their environment? Yeah.
So microaggressions was first coined by Dr. Pearson. I'm drawing a blank. I apologize. But he coined it based on his studies on anti-Blackness and race. And then it has been expanded to include other forms of social constructs like different people of color, gender, religion, abilities, and the list goes on. Microaggressions are the everyday innuendos, are the everyday jokes, are the everyday language or comments that people state that really is questioning a person's identity, or it could be perceived, or it is, frankly, insulting, regardless of the intention. Some classic ones that I think a lot of people have heard is if someone tells a Black individual, but you're not like the other Black people, right? One that I had was a friend at the time told me, well, you articulate so well, you don't talk like you're Puerto Rican. Right? So it's those innuendos, those hurtful jabs that people are saying, and it happens all the time. All the time. And it's exhausting to call them out, but call them out. That's one of the things in anti-racism work is, first of all, we have to examine our attitudes, our behaviors, and our language. So how do we perpetuate those microaggressions? And then when we hear them, because parents, guardians, caretakers will hear them in the presence when their children are with them, what are the parents going to do in that situation?
Right.
And it is tough because oftentimes I think a lot of people I talk to can think about at least one relative that they have that's racist, right? And that has said not even microaggressions, outright racist things, sometimes microaggressions. And what are they going to do in that situation? And it is about calling it out. We're not going to change anything through silence. Does that mean that relationships could be severed? Possibly, right? And everybody has to make that decision for themselves. But the alternative is to be silenced. And in my view, that's not an alternative I'm willing to accept.
And this brings out that thing we talked about a few minutes ago, is being uncomfortable. These are uncomfortable discussions. It's uncomfortable to call people out. And I hear a lot of these when I see microaggressions occurring. I think we do have to be much more aware of them. But also, it is uncomfortable to call them out versus being silent. And a lot of the response that we might hear is, oh, I didn't mean anything by that.
Yeah. So, and I have found recently, I wrapped up a training that I had with a cohort of parents on anti-racism parenting. And a couple of the parents shared out how often they hear it in work, in their place of employment, and how uncomfortable they would feel to bring it out. They would be seen as a not team player, right? They might be seen as just being too sensitive to racist talk or microaggressions. And I give them the same advice. What's your alternative? To accept it and be silent about it, or to do something about it? Could that result in unfortunate consequences? Possibly. And I know it's difficult and challenging because this is your livelihood that you're putting at risk. But to move forward in this work of equity and really truly social justice doesn't happen by plain status quo. And so individuals do have to make that decision for yourself. And I still think that folks can be strategic if they feel they're not getting anywhere, whether it's talking to that employee or employees, if they've said anything, whether talking to the manager and demanding training, whether it's then demanding that your organization has anti-racist policies and procedures and practices in our interactions. Now the organization is taking some responsibility that language, that type of behavior is not tolerated. So now perhaps that employee has a little bit of more fuel, more backing, if that were to happen again.
And this is something I suspect a lot of kids may be experiencing in school as well, which the peer situation and the acceptance of, especially in pre-adolescence and adolescence, can be very straining. Do you have any suggestions or resources, Dr. Dubiel, of things that parents might be able to access to help them communicate some of these things with their kids or problem solve?
Yeah, well, it's going to be a case-by-case basis, definitely, on what's going on. And that's why it's so critical for parents to educate themselves, because there are going to be situations that arise that are very unique. And how do we engage in those conversations with our children at different ages? So one example is I have 2 teenage boys. My kids are so tired of me using them as an example. But I have 2 teenage boys, and my oldest loves rap music. And oftentimes in rap music, they drop the N-word. He knows how I feel, and he knows how he should behave. He doesn't repeat it, and I support him supporting Black artists. I want to support Black artists. We need to support Black artists, but he is not allowed to say that word. He is a model with his friends when all his friends are listening to that and they're practicing for football or they're doing what they need to do. Like, I pay attention and he pays attention. And as a matter of fact, not too long ago, he was at a friend's of friends of friends. I don't know. He was at somebody's house, somebody's house he did not know. And he got invited by a group of friends. And he was there for a little while before he texted me and asked me to come pick him up. And I didn't know why, but I stopped what I was doing to go pick him up. And when he got in the car, he was very upset. And he was upset because this kid's house that he was at kept dropping the N-word. Now, my son is half white. So he's what we consider white passing. So I can't help but to think that this kid who kept dropping the N-word felt empowered to do so because he thought my son, who looks half white or who looks white, wouldn't say anything to him, wouldn't do anything. And my son felt extremely uncomfortable and told his friend that he knew that was there with him and this other kid whose house it was, that he had to go, that he had chores to do, right? So he came up with an excuse to leave. But then I told my son that he could have done better. I said, rather than telling them that you had chores to do, you could have said, that's not okay. I do not tolerate that type of language. In fact, it's racist. I'm out, and walked out. And his response was like, I know, Mom. I just felt so uncomfortable. He goes, I was so angry. I just wanted to get out of there. And I just came up with an excuse. And he goes, and frankly, this wasn't my house. I didn't feel safe. I'm like, okay, but I want to empower you to be more brave. And that does take time and it does take practice, right? So giving them permission and having those practices even at home on how they would engage in these type of situations that could arise, to be prepared.
That's a great example. Thank you for sharing it and using your son.
Don't tell him.
Another question that I wanted to present before we run out of time today, and I haven't seen any posted on the chat, but feel free to, I'll continue to check on that. Another one was really as how can parents be better allies and model this to their kids? And we've talked a little bit about that. Do you have anything that you might want to add in terms of that request?
I think in terms of parents being allies, they have to start with themselves. You cannot be an anti-racist parent without being an anti-racist person. So that means parents, guardians, caretakers, education, education, education. Your education has to be intentional. Find the stories by Black authors, Black experiences, Indigenous people, people of color. Educate yourself. Treat this as a lifetime journey of learning. You have to be consistent in this education. It will get exhausting. It will get draining. It is heart-wrenching to hear the experiences, not only of the historical oppression that occurs, but what's occurring right now as we're talking, right? It's occurring, absolutely. And be vulnerable in that process. Once parents believe that these three mindset shifts are absolutely critical in the work, I think it will translate to their kids. A couple of other tangible things that I tell parents to do. Examine, first of all, their space. Examine your space at home. Do you have toys that are diverse? If you have dolls or whatnot, right? Do you have books from diverse authors? Do you have diverse representation in your books? What about the art in your home? Do you have art and music from diverse artists, right? What about the own relationships you have with people? Do you have positive, meaningful, right? Not ingenuine, meaningful relationships with people who look different from you, people who have had different experiences? And what about the friendships your children have, right? Examine your language. So we talked about examine your space, examine your language. Be mindful of your own microaggressions that you repeat. Be mindful of any coded racial language, right? Oftentimes we hear terms like thugs, right? Or ghetto, when really we know what group of people they're talking about, right? Call it out. And be mindful of how we may be perpetuating that. So I ask parents, if we want to be anti-racist parents, we have to model that in our spaces, in our nonverbal communication, in our language and our communication, our attitudes and behaviors all the time. So it is constantly, and it gets to the point where almost every day you are having a conversations with your child about race. I do. And it could be a 30-second conversation, right? I could turn on the news, for example, and the first thing I see is an individual Black being arrested. And I make a very quick comment. I turn to my boys and I say, this is not in any way indicative of what's going on in the world, right? This Black individual that's getting arrested does not mean that all, by any means whatsoever, all Black or brown people commit crimes. Plus, we don't even know the situation, right? What's occurring. So this is a 30-second conversation, right? All the time. And being mindful. I tell them I often train them on how to observe and watch how people act. I have a couple of t-shirts that are very clear about how I feel on different issues of social justice. So I even have them with me and I say, pay attention to people's behaviors and attitudes. So I think there's many teachable moments, and that the kids build up and scaffold and build their understanding with time.
Those are good. Those are very good pointers. And I think it relates to one of the questions that we had about how do we talk to our children about, you know, good and bad in people. Like you're using the example of somebody gets arrested and you want to have a conversation with your child about that without planting, it looks like, questions about racism into their head. And I think that you may have answered some of that, but do you have anything else to add to that, Dr. Dubiel?
Yeah, well, we do have to talk, right, about racism with our children. And if somebody's asking about the good or bad, let's be clear. We have to show an example of if we're playing with dolls with our kids, the white doll being bad too, right? Mm-hmm. It's not exclusive to the doll of color or people of color. So we talk to our children about good and bad in everyone. And it's not about their skin color, but perhaps the decisions that are being made, perhaps a whole bunch of circumstances that drive that decision to be made. So we do talk about racism with our children, and as they get older, how racism is very much systemic, and how racism is about the historical oppression and power and privilege, and that there are individuals, white individuals, who benefit historically from racism. Does that mean were you responsible for the historical oppression that occurred? No, but there are benefits and privileges and power associated with being white. And so we have to identify that benefit. We have to identify that unearned advantage, so we can talk about how we improve with racism is acknowledging it and understanding that to be anti-racist is to have those conversations about the racism that's very much about systemic structures and systems that impede it. And it starts with individuals, and then those individuals contribute to different organizations and different institutions. So we do have to talk about racism with all of our children. And of course, again, as they get older, we add the complexity and the paradigms of talking deeply about racism. But there are so many fantastic books. There is one that, even for little ones, the kids' book about racism.
There you go.
This is appropriate for 3. I mean, it's a good start. And there's so many. There's this other one by Peter H. Reynolds about teaching kids how to stand up and say something when they hear something, how to be an upstander. We want our children. And I was
thinking that word as you were speaking about it earlier, upstanding, being an upstanding citizen in your school and in your community and in your workplace, et cetera. So those are really important things that I think parents are looking for. And I know we're nearing the end of our time today with you, but you do have a Facebook page on anti-racism parenting, which is one of the reasons why when I saw that, that I thought it would be wonderful to have you speak to our families. Could you give us an understanding of what parents might find if you're seeking out resources and how they can access your Facebook page?
Yeah, it's a fantastic Facebook page for anyone interested in becoming more aware, more conscious about anti-racism parenting. So people can share resources. We vet them through, but people can share resources, and it's organized by discussions, by people's personal stories, by recommended books, by events that are occurring around the world to have conversations about anti-racism. And one of the things we're launching that we're pretty excited about is different Zoom conversations, just no presentation, no specific agenda, but having different conversations about race for parents to self-identify where they're at, so they can identify if they feel they're novice when it comes to racism. So they're just learning. So they'll self-identify and put themselves in that group. Parents who are intermediate. So these are individuals who feel, I get it. I understand how anti-racism is all of our responsibility, but I'm not quite sure understanding how deeply rooted it is in our structures and in our systems, our policies, our procedures, our interactions. And then there's the social action and community ready group. And these are folks who get it. They want to know what to do. where can I make the difference? They're ready to organize and mobilize. So that's really exciting that we're launching as part of that Facebook group.
Wonderful. That's really, I think you're a little vulnerable if you're putting yourself into a category, but I think it's much needed to again feel a little uncomfortable, a little intimidated, but there's a lot to learn and a lot of resources available out there. So I appreciate your willingness to talk with us today. I see that Stacy Montgomery is watching today, and she's going to be presenting to us tomorrow about talking to kids about this as well. So thank you for tuning in. And if we'd like to post your Facebook link on the talk, so we'll make sure we get that on there, and any other resources, Dr. Dubiel, that you think might be beneficial for our parents. I will be sharing that on our website as well as on our Facebook page.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Wonderful having you. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a wonderful talk and very informative.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Enjoyed it. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.